lots of exciting things going on. Well, you met my family out there, so I'm going to start right in with the Utter family heritage, which took place about 125 years ago. So we'll go back a little ways. And first, I'd like to tell you that my grandparents were Sam and Louise Anna Utter. And here is a picture of them on their wedding day. You can pass that around. My grandpa was born in Iowa, and my grandmother was born in Illinois. But her family sold their place in Illinois and moved to Tracy, Iowa, where my grandfather was. And that's where they met, was in Tracy, Iowa. And they met, they fell in love, they got married, and they started having kids. And then they decided they would like to start a new life. They would like to do something different, and so they started planning on what they were going to do. Where were they going to go? They finally decided that they would like to come out west. And one of the reasons that they wanted to come out west is, I'm sure most of you have heard about the Homestead Act that allowed for people to come in and file a claim on 160 acres. And a little further into my presentation, I will read you what that act said. But that sparked their interest because they were actually working the farm that belonged to my grandmother's parents, and they wanted to have their own place. And so they wanted to see if they could possibly do that. They raised a lot of grain and a lot of pigs, and maybe that's where I got my interest in pigs. But we're not going to go into that story. There's an altogether different story out there about the pigs. So they raised grain and a lot of pigs. They sold them in the fall of 1900, and they started out. And they were going to come west. Didn't know for sure where, but they're going to come west. They started out with Grandma and Grandpa, 7 kids, 2 wagons, of which one is out there, 2 teams of horses, and a mule. And they started traveling. They got as far as Pond Creek, Oklahoma. And lo and behold, my grandmother was pregnant with my dad when they left Iowa. Can you believe that? Traveling in that wagon and being pregnant. And my dad was born in Pond Creek, Oklahoma. And he was born on February 25th of 1901. Now there was 4 of us girls in my family, and the one thing that we knew we could really get to my dad on was just call him an Okie. That he did not like. When they got to Pond Creek, Oklahoma, where Grandpa got a job working on the highway department, for the highway department, building bridges. And when work ran out and my dad was old enough to travel, they decided to keep on coming west. And so they did. And again, they started out with Grandma and Grandpa, 8 kids now, 2 wagons, 2 teams of horses, and that mule. And like I mentioned before, one of the reasons why they wanted to come west was because of the Homestead Act that allowed for the filing of an application for 160 acres. And I'm going to read you just a little bit about what the act said. This is the Homestead Laws. The Homestead Law was enacted by Congress in 1862. It provided that anyone who was either the head of a family, 21 years old, or a veteran of 14 days of active service in the U.S. Armed Forces,
Wow.
and who was a citizen or had filed a declaration of intent to become a citizen could acquire a tract of land in the public domain not exceeding 160 acres, which, as most of you probably know, is a quarter section. To acquire title to the land, the homesteader was obligated to settle or cultivate the homestead for 5 years. The federal homestead laws provide an incentive in the form of easily obtainable land for the settlement of the West. That's what they wanted to do, they wanted to get people more out in the West. In 1909, Congress enacted the Enlarged Homestead Act, which doubled the size of the initial homestead grants to a half section, so you could get 320 acres. And reduced the prove-up time from 5 to 3 years. In 1916, Congress passed the Stock Homestead Act, which granted a full section, 640 acres, to marginal areas unsuitable for anything but grazing. So that was the Homestead Act. That was something that my grandparents felt like we ought to take advantage of. So they, to the Colorado Mountains they came. They left Pond Creek, Oklahoma, and they got as far as Denver, about midwinter. And that was a big mistake because they couldn't go anywhere. They couldn't get over the passes, there was too much snow. So they lived in Denver. They rented an apartment. They lived out of 2 wagons, and my granddad worked in a livery stable. Now in those days, of course, there was a whole lot more wagons and teams of horses, and when he worked at the livery stable, when people would come into Denver, they came by horse and wagon. They did their business, but they needed somebody to take care of their horses while they were doing whatever they did. And so he took care of the horses, worked in that livery stable the first year. When the snow started going, and they thought they could get up over the passes, they decided to leave Denver. And they wanted to leave Denver because Grandpa had heard when he was working at the livery stable that there was this great place called Route County, Steamboat Springs. And there was very few people, very little development being done out here, so it had to be the place they needed to go. So they headed for Steamboat Springs. Now they had 8 kids, and again they traveled with their 2 wagons, 2 teams of horses, Grandpa and Grandma, and that mule. That mule went everywhere with them. They did that in search of a new life. It wasn't an easy trip. It was a hard trip. The adults and the kids walked most of the way. So as you can see, there's not much room for anybody to sit in that wagon. So everybody had to walk. Sometimes when they would come to a steep hill, they would have to, one team could not pull a wagon up the hill. So they would have to unhitch one team, hook it in front of the other team, and the 2 teams would pull the wagon up the hill. Once they got it up on top, took the 2 teams off, went back, got the other wagon, and headed up over the hill. Quite a trip. The thing that was interesting to me, and still is they slept underneath those wagons at night. They didn't sleep inside of them. They slept out on the ground. Can you imagine what you're gonna do with 8 kids and grandma? Good grief. And we complain today if we've got a little bit of a wrinkle in our bed sheets. I can only imagine. They actually arrived in Routt County on June the 2nd of 1902. When they got here, Steamboat was a small town, not many buildings, not many people. And when they got to Steamboat, they camped down along the Yampa River. And they camped there for a few days because Grandpa was bound and determined he was going to make application for some land. So he went into the land title office and he made application for 160 acres, which was the law at that time. And what he really wanted to do was, when they came to Steamboat, they saw the river, and he thought, man, that would be a beautiful place to settle, along the river. Well, when he went into the land title office, he found out that that had all been homesteaded, and it wasn't available. So he got as far, or as close to the river as he could. He actually made application for 160 acres out in the Cow Creek area, and that's where the ranch still is today. But they worked on the ranch, and they allowed them, when he got his application approved, they allowed them to move out onto the 160 acres. And basically they had to, because you had to live on the land, you had to clear it, and you had to cultivate it. So the only way to do that would be there. They did all of this. They worked hard to prove up on that 160 acres. At first they had 5 years to do it. I don't know how long it took him. I do know that he got title to the first 160 acres sometime down the road, and he also made application for another 160 acres. So one of the things that I found interesting when I was doing a little research on this is less than 50% of the claims filed for under the Homestead Act were actually ever approved upon.
Wow.
People did not. And Colorado had 205,000 original filings. Only 107 of those were ever finally approved.
Wow.
So less than 50% actually made it. But my family accepted the responsibility, and like I say, they acquired title to the first 160, made application for another 160, but because there were so many people that did not prove upon their land, there was other land available then. So my granddad started buying land. So he bought land besides acquiring it under the Homestead Act. Most of the first summer that they were here, they lived in a dugout, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with dugouts, but it's a dugout. It's a hole in the ground, is basically what it is. It was, and actually it's still there on the place today. Unless you knew what it was, you wouldn't know that that's what it is, but it is still there. It's a hole in this big mound, like this, and it had like an entryway, a door in it. Us kids, when we were younger, we used to go in there and hide from our parents. Especially when there was hard work to do. But it was nice and cool in there. It was beautiful. All dirt. It was basically dirt floors, dirt walls, dirt ceiling. From what I understand, just remembering back some about what my dad and his sister talked about, is in the springtime of the year, when the snow melted, the roof leaked. We have some of those problems today, don't we? And we don't even have dirt roofs. So, but most of that first summer, they lived in the dugout. They had a big tent, and they cleared the land. They cleared the land enough to where my grandmother could plant a pretty good sized garden. So she planted a garden, and there was enough timber on the land that they could cut logs for a log cabin, a small log cabin. So they built this little log cabin next to the dugout, which wasn't quite so bad, and they built a barn and they dug a well that first year. Those people were busy. That was a busy time. I just can't even imagine. But they lived on deer meat, fish, and out of what my grandmother could raise in the garden. But as they went along, they each year they cleared more land, and eventually they began to raise grain, hay, and later years they planted a lot of potatoes. Now, and they also bought some livestock. They were among some of the first settlers into the Yampa Valley. During this time, 2 more brothers were born. So they had 10 kids. The roads weren't plowed. I mean, all they were was wagon trails. So the roads weren't plowed. So if you wanted to go to town, you went to town on a sled and a team of horses. Now, I'm going to date myself here, people, because, believe it or not, I have ridden to town in a sled with a team of horses over some of those roads. That tells you how old I am. But anyway, we always made it. It was funny because my dad had a sister that was down on Yampa Street. She had a little house down there. And we used to bring that team of horses and a sled in on like Saturdays. And it'd take us almost all day to get here. We'd spend the night with her. Then we'd get our groceries and we'd go home the next day. So it wasn't an hour trip like we do now. You know, it was a long 2 days for us.
How many miles do you think it is?
About 12. Oh, well, we traveled about 12 miles from the ranch to town. But when they were coming from Iowa, they were lucky if they made 6 to 8 miles a day.
Wow.
So can you imagine? Oh, yeah. There was no mail route back then either. I mean, there was no mail delivery. So whoever went to town would stop in at the post office, pick up everybody's mail, and they delivered the mail all around to the neighbors. They finally did establish a mail route which went up the Pleasant Valley, and somebody would go and meet the mailman and pick up the mail. Didn't have to quite go all the way into Steamboat. And in the springtime of the year, when the snow started to melt, no way they could use a vehicle back then, and so the mail carrier used a horse and delivered the mail by horse. My granddad ran a lot of sheep. He had forest permits to run sheep on the forest, and the forest permits would allow 2,000 head for one permit. I don't know how many he had, but I do know that he had one because I've seen his card at the Forest Service office. But he used to run a lot of sheep. They would put them on the forest during the summer, bring them home in the winter, and then they would feed them. They would cut hay off of the place, and they would feed them hay in the winter time. That was a lot of work with sheep, it was. Sometimes they wouldn't raise enough hay for, especially if it was a dry year, they were in drought, they wouldn't have enough hay on the ranch because that's a non-irrigated ranch, it's a dry land ranch. And so, came springtime of the year, they ran out of hay. So my dad and his brother would take sleds and they'd go down along the river and buy hay and haul it home in order to feed the sheep, because they just didn't have the capability of raising enough hay. But I actually remember my dad telling me about how cold it was going down along that river and picking up that hay and taking it home. Not one of his jobs that he loved doing, that's for sure. Back before World War I, they started to build a new house on the place. And they hauled material from Steamboat, and they also cut a lot of it off of the place. And they hauled that stuff by team because there was no other way to get their materials. But back in 1918, my dad's brother Guy was called into action in the Army. And he went into the Army. It's kind of a fascinating story for me. He went into the Army, of course he didn't want to go, not that he didn't want to support the United States, he didn't want to leave the ranch. And he sent many, here's a couple of pictures of, he passed away, and that's pictures of his funeral. He didn't want to leave the ranch, and he sent many letters back to my mother about, how's everything going, how's the harvest going, all of this. And so the thing that was interesting to me was he actually died. He was wounded, and he got killed over there in World War I. And he wrote letters nearly every day. And when my parents passed away, I found this box. It was a pretty good sized box that had a bunch of letters in it. And I just couldn't understand why all those letters were there. Well, they were letters from my dad's brother Guy. And he had sent those letters all the time that he was in the service. He wrote letters all the time. And he sent those. But because he was overseas, it took those letters a while to get here. He passed away before some of the letters made it. My grandmother never opened those letters. She never opened them when they came. And after my parents passed away, I found this box, and I looked at them, I said, oh my gosh, these are all letters from Guy when he was in the service, and they haven't been opened. It was a challenge for me. Do I open these? Or do I not? And of course, curiosity got the best of me. And I opened them. And they were very interesting. But he tried every which way to, he did not want to be there. He wanted my granddad to try and get him out of the service. He thought he had a good friend, that his wife was able to get him out, out of the service. And he wanted to know if Granddad could do the same thing, because there was so much harvesting to be done and all of this. And so, but of course that never happened because he was wounded and died over there.
And then they shipped his body back from France to Steamboat.
Yes.
He was the first casualty of a Routt County citizen. And they had this big parade, which is what Nadine, not parade, memorial.
Yes.
To get Guy back.
Yes. Yeah, and his body didn't come back for a couple of years.
Long time.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So it was quite a big deal when his body finally got back. And there's a couple of pictures up here. At the top, you'll see pictures of the procession following the casket. The town was basically shut down. The county was basically shut down. And everybody went to his funeral.
When was the funeral?
That was in 1921, was when he finally got back and they were able to give him the proper,
Acknowledgement that he
yes, that he needed.
deserved.
So, yeah. The other thing that I find pretty interesting is my granddad, or my grandmother, was killed in a car wreck right below the house where I live today. Her and my granddad were going to town one day in an old Model T or Model A, whatever it was, and that's when there was actually a mailman, and the mailman was going the other direction, and they had a head-on. And my grandmother got a big gash in her leg, and she was bleeding profusely. So they rushed her to the hospital. I'm sure they didn't rush. That was probably the wrong word. They got her to the hospital, and they sewed up her leg and everything. And she spent the night. And the next morning, they got a hold of my granddad, and they said, she's ready to go home now. You can come and get her. So he went to get her. And when he got there, when she got up out of bed to get dressed, there was a blood clot in her leg. And it went to her heart. And by the time he got there,
Wow.
she was gone. She passed away.
How old was she?
You know, she was born in, I can't tell you that, Candace. I don't remember how old she was.
Do you know about how old she was and how old the children were at that time?
All of the children were grown at that time. So she had to be in her late 50s, 60s. It's up at the cemetery on their stone. I just have never paid that much attention. I'm sorry, but I didn't. What that meant was when she passed away, it left my granddad and my dad and his one brother running the ranch. That's my dad with a couple of the neighbors' boys. Grandpa was quite distraught, and well, so were all of the kids. But they were all quite distraught when Grandma passed away. She was definitely the head of the household. But my grandpa, he took it hard. And he started drinking. And he started gambling. And by that time, he had acquired about 2,000 acres of land out there. And he got to gambling, he got to drinking. And I hate to say it, but I'm sure people took advantage of that. And he started gambling away all the land. And the boys, my dad and his brother John, didn't realize what was going on until they went to get on a piece of land. And the neighbor came by and said, you don't own this, you're trespassing. Get off of here. We own this now. So he gambled away all but 680 acres of that ranch. And when my dad and his brother found that out, I'm sure it wasn't a pretty scene, but they took my granddad and they rented him an apartment in Oak Creek. Because if you know anything about Oak Creek, it was a humming town in those days. I mean, lots of gambling, lots of drinking. I mean, that was a hopping town. So they got him an apartment there. And they just left him there. And in the meantime, my mother was, she was born and raised around Haxton, Colorado. And when she got older, she wanted to go to high school. Grandpa said on her side, no way. No girl of mine's going to go to high school. You don't need that education. So her and two of her brothers decided that they'd buy a little piece of property and they would start farming themselves. So they did. They worked hard. They raised grain, they raised corn. My mom had a big garden. She raised chickens, sold eggs, milked cows. They did all those things that a farmer does. And lo and behold, I had another grandpa that was a gambler and an alcoholic.
No.
And he taught those 3 kids out of giving him everything
No.
that they had. So he basically ended up with their ranch, with their farm, and they had no place to go. Well, the ranch next to my dad's, where my dad and his brother had, belonged to Mom's sister, my mother's sister. So she came, my mother came to live with her sister. And lo and behold, here comes Russell, my dad, and he liked to go over there for meals because he got tired of cooking for himself. So he used to go over there for meals, and he used to go up the old covered wagon roads, and first they became friends, and then they became a little more than friends, and they were married in January of 1930. And so then Mom moved in to the house with the 2 boys, her husband, my dad, Russell, and brother John, and her, and they ran the ranch. Well, Grandpa came back in 1931, but only long enough that he was basically on his deathbed. He had drank himself to death. And so he came back to the ranch for one last time, and he passed away in 1931. They finally finished that house that they had started way back when, and that's where my mother, she moved in with the guy. She used to say to us girls, I was nothing more than a maid. All I did was cook and clean for these guys. But actually, she had a share in the ranch too. When Grandpa passed away, he left the ranch to all of the kids. Even though my dad and his brother and my mom were actually doing the operating of it, Grandpa left that to all. There wasn't 10 kids because 3 had passed away. So there were 7 kids that he left that ranch to. And eventually, my dad, with him and Mom, were able to buy everybody out. So they owned the ranch by themselves. And John got tired, brother John, he got tired of working hard. So he got married and went to California. And so my dad, my mom bought everybody out, and then they owned the ranch on their own. So they owned the 680 acres. And that's all that was left after my grandpa gambled everything away. All they had left was 680 acres. Now I had 3 sisters. One passed away when she was 16. Her kidneys failed in 1949, and that was before there was dialysis. And so she passed away at the age of 16. So that left the 3 of us girls. We worked hard. Oh, and the story, I have to tell you the story. I came along very late in my parents' life. They were way in their 40s by the time I came along. And there's 5 years between me and that sister that's next to me, or was closest to me. There was 5 years between us. And when my dad found out that they were going to have another kid, oh my gosh, it has to be a son. I have to finally get this son that I've been waiting for. Well, my Mother put Oliver Garden in the day before I was born, which was
No.
June the 2nd in 1942. Now you can figure it out. And she put it in Oliver Garden. She went into labor. My dad was waiting, of course, out there to hear all the good news about this great son he was going to have. The doctor came out and he said, "Oh, you got another beautiful baby girl." And I think my dad would have died if he could have. But he didn't. What he did was he got in the pickup, a 1940 Chevy pickup, and he went home. I'm surprised he took me home, but he did. He did. Eventually, I got to go home. But the thing that happened there was he wanted a son, and so I was his son. I did everything on the outside. I could harness horses. I could run all kinds of machinery. I could fix anything. But by gosh, when I got married, I couldn't boil water. I was his son, and we were inseparable. Us girls worked hard. We worked hard on that ranch. We never hired anybody to help, so it was all up to us girls and our folks to keep it going. And we did that. It was pretty much uninterrupted work for years. We used to milk cows twice a day, put up hay, do all those things. And we fed a lot of bum lambs. I don't know if you know what a bum lamb is, but it's one that has lost its mother. And so you have to feed them. Twice a day you have to feed them milk. And it was not unusual to have a number of bum lambs around. And you can see that's part of them right there. That happens to be Peggy, Elizabeth, and Rudolph. That was our 3 bum lambs that year. Rudolph got the name because when she was born, she had this big boil on the end of her nose, and she looked just like Rudolph. She had this big boil here on the end of her nose, and so we named her Rudolph. But we fed them lambs, fed them all summer. We fed them twice a day. Oh, they followed us everywhere, especially when we'd go in the house, and oh, my mother did not like that. But they did. They followed us around just like a puppy dog. Well, when it came time to ship lambs in the fall time of the year, my dad said, they were all ewe lambs. He said, those lambs gotta go. We're gonna ship those lambs. And us girls, of course, we cried. And they came with the big semi and loaded all the cattle and the sheep that were gonna be sold. And we cried. And the truck pulled out of the yard. And we still cried. And Daddy came in the house and Mom said, those sheep aren't going to market. She said, you better get in the pickup and stop that truck.
Good Mom.
So he took the old 40 pickup and he headed out after that semi. And the guy happened to stop in Kremlin to eat.
Yes.
And when he stopped in Kremlin to eat, all they had to do was open up that gate on the back of that semi, and those 3 lambs came out. And they were more than happy to get in the pickup. So he hauled them home. You know, we put sideboards up so they couldn't jump out. And oh, were we ever so happy when those lambs showed up. We thought that was great.
Good for moms.
Yeah, and so my dad always said, you know, they're not going to raise very good lambs and all this. And we said, you just wait. Just
Amen.
Wait. And I'll be doggone if we bred them, of course, that year. And 2 of them had twins. and Elizabeth had triplets.
Wow.
So they more than proved to him that they were going to be good producers. We actually had to take one off of Elizabeth because she only had hookups for 2 lambs. So we ended up raising one as a bum anyway, but it was okay. And like I say, the work on the ranch continued uninterrupted for years. But back in the 1970s, my parents' health was beginning to fail. And they decided it was time to do some estate planning. So they did some estate planning. And there were 3 of us girls living at that time. And to reward us girls for all the hard work that we had put into that ranch to make it what it was, and for them to have what they had, they gave each one of us girls 160 acres. So we all had 160 acres. In 1975, I was married and I built a log home on my 160 acres. And the other girls lived away, and so they just basically did nothing much with their land. But when my folks, their health began to fail, my dad realized that he could no longer manage the ranch. So I became the ranch manager, and I was the ranch manager on that ranch for 10 years. My dad had a stroke in 1979, and he was up here for a while, and then they took him to a home in Laramie, Wyoming. But I got in the ambulance with him as they were taking him up to Laramie, and he said to me, I only have one request for you. He said, you're the ranch manager, and I want you to keep that ranch in a working operation, and don't you subdivide it. And I have pretty much done that with my portion, but I have no control over what my sisters did. They're both gone now. I'm the only one living, and they left their 160s to their kids. Their kids had not much attachment to the land, and you all know what happened. The land's all been sold. But I still have my piece of heaven. I still have mine, and I'm going to maintain it as long as I possibly can. And as ornery and as stubborn as I am, we're going to keep going. As long as we possibly can. Now, the wagon has been in the family it was in the family before 1900, I'm sure. But it's been in the family, at least we know, since 1900, when they started coming west. So we know it's that old. And after my parents passed away, I didn't inherit that wagon, I took it. I did, because it was deteriorating. And after my mother and father had passed away, I rented their house to an outfitter. Big mistake. But anyway, he decided to start having steak fries off of it. So he pulled it out in the pasture and he started having steak fries off of it. And he started trying to rebuild it, and, did things to it. And I said, this ain't gonna work. This isn't gonna work. And actually he never paid his rent, so I had to evict him anyway. But I managed to get somebody to haul that wagon over to my house where I lived. I had that out in my lawn for years, and I used to decorate it. As bad as shape as it was in, I used to decorate it with Christmas lights. And it sat out there, and I kept saying there has to be somebody that can rebuild that wagon for me. I just need to be able to find them. So I went to an auction. I love auctions. And I went to an auction and I was telling the gals that were checking me out there about this old wagon that I had that I wanted to get rebuilt. And the gal said to me, oh, I know a guy that just built a sheep wagon for a man. And she said he did a fabulous job. And so she gave me his number. And it was Kenny. And I called him and I asked him, I said, you know, do you have any desire to build a covered wagon, or you want to come and look at it? So he came and looked at it. And I didn't know until this morning. He gave me a little indication of how he felt this morning about that wagon when he came to look at it. And he said to me this morning, first time I ever heard it, my God, what have I gotten myself into? What am I going to do with this now? But anyway, as we explained out there, it was quite the job to load it. And even though he had put on a big face, poker face, and told me, oh yeah, I can do it. Oh yeah, sure, I can do it. I don't think he ever was sure he could. But as you see, he did. And he's done a great job with it. I am forever grateful for Kenny Harris. I mean, we would not be having this wagon out here today if it wasn't for that man. And I don't mean just from the standpoint that he rebuilt it. He hauls it everywhere for me. I mean, if I want to take it somewhere, I call up Kenny. Oh yeah, I'll come and get it. I'll take it. He took it. You probably heard him say he took it to Yampa yesterday. It was in the parade. He parked it on the street last night and slept in it. He slept in it last night.
Wait, tell him where Kenny lives. Not in Yampa.
No, he lives in Hamilton, which is between Craig and Meeker, back up the river. And so it's quite a chore for him to come and get that wagon. But, you know, he loves it or he wouldn't be doing it. Anyway, he slept in it last night. He said to me this morning, it got pretty cold in there. Well, we actually went to the fireworks in Yampa, and I'm going to put in a little plug for the fireworks in Yampa. If you've never been there on the 4th of July, their fireworks are fantastic. They really do, they really go all out for their fireworks. But the other thing that we found is when we were coming back from Yampa last night, we were going through Oak Creek, and they've got this fabulous show too. So if you ever want to see a good fireworks, go up to those little towns. They'll show you a good thing. But we stopped and we wanted to see if Kenny was actually on the street last night. So we stopped and he had parked it there at the park. Of course, we hollered at him and told him, you can't be parked here. And he looks at us and then he realized who it was. And we said, are you going to be okay? And he said, yeah, I'm going to be okay. I'm just getting ready to go to bed now. And he said, I'm going to be okay. So this morning he told me it got pretty dark. Oh, there was frost on my cooler this morning. And I said, well, did you do okay? He said, yeah, I had 2 sleeping bags. So he did okay. But yesterday was a big milestone for me. It was one of the things that I had always hoped I could do, and that is to have that wagon pulled by horses. The first year we put it in the steamboat parade when it was done, and we had it pulled by that 1940 Chevy pickup that my dad had, and it now belongs to a man in Encampment, Wyoming. And he was willing to bring it down and pull that wagon with that pickup. So the year that we showed it here in Steamboat, that's the way it was transported. Last year was in the parade in Yampa also, but it was pulled by a 1-ton flatbed truck. And it was okay, it was fun. People got to ride in the back of the truck and it was fun. But I said, No, we're gonna have this thing pulled by horses. Now, little did I realize what a challenge I had put myself into to try and find a team of horses. People do not use horses anymore. There are very few people that have horses. And then finding them that aren't already talked or spoken for was another challenge. But we put word out on Facebook. I called people, everything, trying to find a team, and we finally found a team, a really great team out at Deponis yesterday off of the Bar A Ranch. They were super, did a great job. I fulfilled one of the greatest dreams I had, and my other dream is to have this wagon out here for people to enjoy. It'll be here back till the Labor Day. I think it'll be out here on display. This wagon is not for my enjoyment. It's for everybody's enjoyment. And it's for everybody to just take a look back at where we came from and how we got here today. So I want you to enjoy the wagon while it's here, and hopefully I'll put it in some parade again next year. Yes?
Do you know what route that wagon went from Denver to get to Steamboat, or what pass, or how did it,
We
what
can
road?
get over Rabbit Ears. So
Rabbit
it
Ears.
came down through Walcott and over Gore Pass.
Gore Pass, okay.
Yeah,
All right.
yeah, that's the way it got here.
Okay.
So, yeah. Any other questions? Well, thank you for coming and listening to me.